Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to everyone who's joined us online as well. My name is Josh Slater. It's my honour and privilege to be an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Science. I'm also a member of staff here in the Vet School, and it's my genuine pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Melbourne and Melbourne Veterinary School's Werribee campus. I'll say a few words about what lies ahead for today and then hand over to our keynote speaker, Professor Madeleine Campbell, in just a few minutes. Now, we believe this is a unique event, and we're absolutely thrilled that you've all made the effort to come here. And I know that we've got people from across all of the Australian states and internationally, New Zealand and the UK, and we have an international and national audience online. What makes this unique, we believe, is that this is a gathering of like-minded people from across a very wide range of disciplines and sectors that use animals in sport. And we're absolutely thrilled to have representation from all of the major equestrian disciplines, everything from racing through equestrianism into a wide range of other disciplines. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. And everything from professional down to grassroots. And that cross-section of the horse industry is really important. Not only that, we have dogs in sport represented. In the room, we have greyhound racing represented, and online we have greyhound racing and sled dogs. And we think this is quite an unusual opportunity to bring together such a wide range of disciplines that use animals in sport in all sorts of different ways. And the reason why we've done this is because it's quite difficult for us in our own industry areas to really know what's going on in other sectors. And we tend to think of our problems as different or perhaps special or unique. But I think what we'll learn today as we go through the day, that actually the concerns that we face, both from internally and externally, are probably common. And I suspect there are common solutions to what the future of animals' welfare in sport looks like. And today is all about taking a future focus. We understand well what the current state looks like, but I'm sure there'll be some useful sharing of ideas about what's happening in each of our sectors. And the panel session that we have at the end of the morning will be an opportunity to draw out some of that information. But today is really about looking forwards and thinking not just what does good welfare look like now, but what does it need to look like in 5 years or 10 years' time. And we don't want today to be a one-off. We don't want this to be an occasion where we come together, have some good discussion, and then there's nothing further from that. We want this to be the start of something long-term. We want there to be tangible outputs from today. So we, the organisers, have committed to writing this up and to publishing an account of today. And if you're wondering why we asked you to complete that consent form, it's because we need your permission to talk about today and what you've all contributed. So thank you for giving your consent for that. The act of publishing what we talk about today is important because it becomes a record that's in the literature and becomes searchable. And then it's something that we and others can refer back to. I hope it will also give you some tangible outputs that you can put into play back in your own organisations. And what we'd like to think very much is that today will be the start of something long running. The reason for this is that we will have common problems, we will have shared solutions, and our joined up voice across the animal sectors will be much stronger than our individual voices. This is all about really thinking about what can we do better by working together. And we hope that you, everyone here today, both in the room and online, will become the start of a powerful coalition. And we'd very much like you to become the leaders and the champions for this sort of cross-discipline, cross-species, future welfare focus. So that's why we're here today. It's about bringing you together. It's about sharing ideas. and looking to the future. We've set the day up with some information delivery at the start. So we have our keynote speaker, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, that will set the scene. Julie Fiedler and I will be doing two very short setup sessions, really posing some questions. Then we go into the panel, and that's going to be really about thinking about what's the current state look like. Break for lunch, and then we go into the workshop sessions this afternoon, which is all about that future focus. What do we need to look for? And I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be some great discussion, and so good to have you here. So that's why we're here. Let me just run through some important details before we get underway. Today's only possible because of you and your willingness to come and give up your time, and thank you again for that. It's also possible only because of our kind sponsors that we've had. Very grateful to University of Melbourne and Melbourne Veterinary School for donating the use of the facilities for today, and for our sponsors, World Horse Welfare and Greyhound Racing Victoria, and also University of Nottingham, who we're doing this venture in partnership with. And we'll talk about the future and next steps of keeping this powerful coalition moving at the end of this afternoon. But this is something that we are doing internationally through University of Melbourne, University of Nottingham, and I hope all of you. Before we begin the meeting itself, I would like to pause for a moment and acknowledge all First Nations peoples from the various countries that are represented here, from across all of the states of Australia, from New Zealand, and from any other parts of the world. I'd like to pay, on behalf of all of us, my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We're on Bunurong country here. For those of you who came out from Melbourne, when you cross the Yarra River, you cross from Wurundjeri land into Bunurong country. And I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people as the traditional owners of these unceded lands on which this lovely campus sits. I'd also like to acknowledge all First Nations people across Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the world as our first scientists and One Health practitioners. And something that's very pertinent for today is that around the world, especially in Australia, but in all regions, First Nations knowledge systems have recognized the key concepts of animal sentience and animal agency for tens of thousands of years. And these are concepts which are only now just becoming embedded into our westernized animal welfare laws. And you'll know that they're a central feature of the new animal welfare provisions in Victoria. And sentience and agency are going to play very large today. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge First Nations people as having recognized this for tens of thousands of years. We're still catching up. So I'd also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be with us today, either in the room or online. So thank you again for joining. I would just like to say two words about Melbourne Veterinary School. It's a very special place. We are Australia's first vet school. The gentleman on your left is William Kendall. He was an enterprising young British vet from Lancashire who decided to head off to the New World to find a new start and set sail for New Zealand from Liverpool. And in 1880 arrived in Melbourne, a booming gold rush city full of animals and only a handful of vets. And he decided this is where he would settle, opened a veterinary practice, a real entrepreneur in all senses, and opened a private veterinary school, private veterinary college. It's on Brunswick Street. Many of you will have walked past it. It's the building with the gold horse head above the door. It now belongs to Anglia Catholic University, but it's still there. And that was the origin of the school. This campus was established in 1962. We are still Victoria's only vet school, and we're very proud of that history, but we're also very forward-looking. And the campus is very much a reflection of that. You'll have noticed the lovely landscaping and the beautiful new buildings. This lecture theatre is one of the older parts, but it sits underneath this building on the right of your screen, the Learning and Teaching building. That opened in 2019. And I think it's one of the best examples of beautiful modern learning architecture. And I think you'll be inspired when you're up there. You're on the second floor of that building for the workshops this afternoon. This building was designed very carefully to acknowledge its place in Bunurong land and culture. And you'll notice if you step outside that the building architecture, the fabrics and materials blend beautifully into the environment. It's got a strong sense of place. And do look out for references, very respectful references to indigenous animals as you walk around the building. You won't have noticed, but when you walked in from the front door to here along the concrete floor, there are brass rings set into the floor. They represent air bubbles of platypus as they feeding and going about their business. And each floor has a reference to indigenous animals of reference. So see if you can spot them there by the lift shafts, but you'll see echidna spines, you'll see possum fur, and you'll see wedge-tail eagle feathers represented. And that's very important to us, that we recognize in the place that we live and work the sense of place that our building has. Right, so let me welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Madeleine Campbell, who's flown in from the UK en route to the ICES conference in New Zealand, but really great that you could stop off in Melbourne and give your talk. Maddie, for those of you who don't know her, is one of the world's leading opinion leaders in animal ethics. I'll leave that. One of the world's leading opinion leaders in animal ethics. She's Professor of Veterinary Ethics at Nottingham University and has, I think, a fairly unique position in having been a key advisor to both equestrian sports through the FEI and also greyhound racing through Greyhound Racing Board of UK. So Maddie, thank you so much for talking to us today and very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I just wanted to start off with a few thank yous of my own. Thank you to the University of Melbourne and the Vet School for hosting us. Heartfelt thank yous from me to Josh and Julie for having collaborated in this idea of getting this work going between our two universities and engaging with all of you across sports. I am so grateful to both of you, and particularly for the massive amount of administrative work Julie's done. Julie, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you to our sponsors, to World Horse Welfare for having made this event possible, and to Greyhound Racing Victoria for further support. It's lovely to have both sports involved in supporting this meeting. And thank you from me to all of you as well for making use of your time to be here. We know you're all very busy professionals, and it means a lot that you've all joined us today. And Josh has already explained why we think that's important. I think I hope that as I go through my talk, I'll be able to explain to you why I personally think it's actually critical that all of us working across the range of sports that use non-human animals do work together in order to ensure that those sports can continue. Declarations of interest, just to be very transparent up front, you can see those of mine, which I think are relevant, listed on the slide there. So I thought, since we have joined from a number of different sports and from different countries as well, it might make sense to start by just doing a little bit of a context setting about where we all are. And this will be familiar to each of you, of course, in your own sports, but perhaps you don't know what's been going on so much in the other sports. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes giving you some examples of that. The social license for using non-human animals in sport is something which has become a familiar concept to all of us in this room, probably over the last couple of years. And that is thanks in large part to the work of World Horse Welfare, and particularly, in fact, to this paper, which was published with Janet Douglas as the lead author. Janet's here today, and she's going to be on the panel later this morning. And that's really got everyone talking about the social license for using non-human animals in sport, and whether or not the public in all of our countries and internationally still finds it morally and ethically acceptable that we should be using non-human animals in that way. All of you will be able to think of examples from your own sport of the kind of headlines that have appeared around this discussion. In the UK, which obviously is my major area of experience, when I look back, a lot of the discussion started, I think, about a decade ago, actually. And one could almost pinpoint it. It's funny how, in retrospect, one can sometimes see moments in time at which, things started to change. And we have a race in the UK called the Grand National, which is this big, long steeplechase race with very large fixed fences. And over a decade ago, now, it had been becoming a little bit controversial for a while, and about a decade ago, a bit longer now, there was a moment or a year in which the vets who were responsible for looking after the horses involved in that race asked that if a horse fell in the first lap, it could be left in place for them to treat. It's a 2-lap race, and before that, the practice had been to try and move the horse quickly off the track so that the horses on the second lap would be able to continue unhindered. And the vets thought it was more in the horse's interest if the horse could stay still and they could treat it if it had fallen. And so that was what they asked to do. And that was what was agreed to for welfare reasons. And it then got shown on television. So that's what you can see in the bottom left of this slide. And for the first time, many of the people who watched that race realized what had actually been going on for many years, because they could clearly see the horses in the second lap being diverted around a horse that was still being treated on the floor. And that actually, I think, was a bit of a moment of realization for the public about what using animals in sport actually involved. And in my mind's eye, when we look back now, I think that was certainly a trigger for the kind of conversation that's evolved since then. And the interesting things about that, I think, are A, that the decisions that were made for very good welfare reasons and were entirely appropriate veterinary decisions, and B, the way in which the public reacted to that and their kind of increased awareness of the way in which humans were using animals. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later, about public awareness, about how non-human animals are living. And then the conversation went on from there in the UK, at least. So having started off really around horse racing, it fairly rapidly then evolved to involve other equestrian sports as well. And you can see some examples here. So in dressage, for example, the issue of hyperflexion, so-called roll cur, is one that's been a lot of discussion about. And in eventing, the issue of rotational falls, there's been concern about. And of course, that actually relates to concern for the well-being not only of the equine athletes, but also of human athletes. So across equestrian sports over the last decade plus, there have been an increasing number of headlines, of discussions about the way in which non-human animals, equine athletes being used in sport, are being treated. And this is a slide which is taken from those of the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission of the FEI, on which I was lucky enough to be invited to sit for the last couple of years. And it just demonstrates some of those headlines from across the world. You will all have your own examples, I'm sure, from your sports and your countries of similar kind of things. And it hasn't been only to do with horses. So the reason we're all in this room today, from greyhound racing and sled dog racing, as well as the equestrian world, is that the conversation has also rapidly evolved to include other non-human animals who are used in sports. So again, in Great Britain at the moment, greyhound racing is a matter of public conversation. We are facing calls for a ban on greyhound racing from 3 of the large canine charities, and the Scottish parliaments and Welsh parliaments are currently consulting about it. So it's quite high up on the political agenda back home. And I know that in the sled dog world, also there have been some media concerns about all of that. And we'll come back and talk a bit more about the role of media in this later on. Over the last couple of years, there have been some really interesting surveys done. The first was done by World Horse Welfare, and you can see the results of that here. It showed that 40% of those they surveyed only supported the continued involvement of horses in sport if more safety and welfare measures were put in place. Over half felt that welfare should be prioritised more in communications. Interestingly, 16% felt that their confidence about the protection of horse welfare had been negatively affected by media coverage. And again, I'm going to come back and talk about media coverage in a few moments' time. And then you can see at the bottom of this slide that 1 in 5 people actually didn't support the continued involvement of horses in sport under any circumstances. And that's an important message for all of us who are working in these sports. The FEI, Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, also ran 2 big surveys as part of its work. They were international surveys. They had huge numbers of respondents, as you can see here. Those from the equestrian community, in other words, from FEI, equestrian stakeholders, and those from what's described as the general public, which are other equestrian stakeholders, but non-FEI. And what was interesting about those surveys was that 67% of the public respondents said they were concerned about the involvement of horses in equestrian sport and specifically concerned about welfare. And so the message that's coming out of all of these is that it is not only external stakeholders who are concerned about the welfare of the non-human animals we're using in sport. These surveys, the World Horse Welfare ones and the FEI ones, between them very clearly showed that actually the majority of internal equestrian stakeholders are concerned about the welfare of the horses who are involved in equestrian sport. And that is a really important message for us to understand, although it may not come as a surprise to those of us in the room today, because actually we are ourselves some of those internal stakeholders, and I certainly count myself as one of those. Now, from some stakeholders, that criticism is absolute. That's the kind of 20% we saw in the previous slide who just don't support the use of animals in sport, whatever, however good the welfare would be. They just think it is not ethically acceptable, full stop. And I'll explain that in terms of ethical theory in a few moments' time. But a lot of the criticism is not absolute, it's relative in the sense that it's coming from people who don't philosophically object to the use of non-human animals in sport, but they think it's only ethical providing we do it properly. In other words, providing we appropriately protect the welfare. And Julie's going to talk about safeguarding welfare later this morning. And that is certainly my own position. It's certainly the view that was reflected in those surveys from World Horse Welfare and the FEI Commission. As far as I know, similar surveys haven't been undertaken with greyhounds or with sled dogs, but we can see that there's a similar concern there also from internal stakeholders, because, for example, in Great Britain, we have this comprehensive welfare strategy being delivered by the Greyhound Board of Great Britain. And for example, in the world of sled dog racing, we have these guidelines being produced by the vets who are involved in that, which are aimed at protecting the welfare of those sled dogs. So there's obviously internal stakeholder concern as well as external concern. And the internal concern is that we should do things properly in the sense of properly optimizing and safeguarding welfare. Now, we're going to spend a lot of today talking about welfare. As I already mentioned, Julie's going to talk about safeguarding it in a few minutes' time. Josh is going to talk to us about whether horses and animals involved in sport can have positive experiences in the course of that involvement. So I'm not going to talk much more about welfare. I'm going to concentrate instead on talking about ethics. And it's an important distinction because, as I always try to explain to my students, ethics is not the same as welfare. Now, ethics is described as a normative subject, and that's one of those things I always have trouble remembering what it means. So the way in which I explain it to myself is that ethics is about whether we should do something at all, whether it should be done, whether it ought to be done, how we value things, which things are good and bad, which actions are right and wrong. Whereas welfare, in comparison, in my mind, is about how we ought to do things if we think we should be doing it at all. So if, for example, we think it is ethically justifiable to use animals in sport, then how do we do that in terms of optimizing their welfare? So they're different, ethics and welfare, but you can see, of course, that they absolutely tie in to each other, because very often our ethical decision-making about whether or not we think something is acceptable is informed by what we know about the welfare impacts of that activity. And so as ethicists, it's really important that we're able to rely upon the work of welfare scientists to provide us with the evidence base that we need to make practical, applied, ethical decisions. And what that means is that in terms of welfare, what we should be trying to do always is to minimize negative welfare impacts and maximize positive welfare impacts, because as Professor Christopher Wathis, who you can see here, is one of my great mentors and the person who got me involved in ethics to begin with, as he explained in relation to farm animals, it's rarely the case that the use of animals, human use of animals, is ethically acceptable if the animals having a preponderance of negative welfare effects. Those kind of animals literally don't have lives worth living, as he described it. And this was an idea which was developed by Professor David Mellor, who, of course, will be very familiar to many of you down here in this part of the world. He went on to develop this idea of minimizing negative welfare effects, of maximizing positive welfare effects. And he kind of developed the idea of having lives worth living into one of animals having a good life. So in other words, not just a kind of bare minimum of lives which were not so appalling that they'd be better off dead, but actually a positive standard of animals' experiences being good when taken across their lifetime. And that's a really important part of what David Mellor developed and explained. So the idea is that an animal may experience some negative welfare impacts, it will experience some positive welfare impacts, but when taken across its lifetime, if the positive outweigh the negative, then we can say that that animal has a good life. And that the second part of that sentence is important for those of us who are using animals in sport, because what it means, it actually supplies one of our ethical justifications for using animals in sport, because it means that if at any one moment in time an animal has a negative experience, for example, if it gets injured, providing that that is immediately identified, appropriately treated, they get good veterinary care and so forth, and that for the rest of their lives, the animals are experiencing positive welfare effects, then overall, when taken across their lifetime, from the animal's point of view, they will have had a good, positive life. And that's an important thing for us to be able to explain, and it reiterates again the importance of welfare effects informing our ethical decision-making. And it kind of makes sense, because none of us as humans actually expect that we're going to swan through life not having any negative effects. We just hope that overall our experience of life will be a positive one. Now, one could make the same argument, of course, about animals which we were using for meat production. So we could say, well, yes, at the end of their lives, those animals are going to be transported and they're going to be held as an abattoir before they're slaughtered. So there will be negative impacts at the end of their lives. But providing that for the rest of their lives, they are appropriately looked after, their welfare needs are met and so forth, we could nonetheless argue that across their lifetimes, those farm animals could be given a good life. And this kind of flags up to me something that I think is a real issue at the moment, and it's almost too big an issue to talk about in this meeting, but it's something I think we all need to be aware of, which is there are quite incoherent public attitudes at the moment. So there are quite a lot of people who would say they oppose the use of non-human animals in sport, and yet don't oppose the use, for example, of animals for food sources for humans, and they don't object to dogs being bred which can't breathe normally every day of their lives, although they do object to greyhounds racing, which are actually much healthier animals than a lot of the dogs which are being used as pets. And they find it quite cute and entertaining to see dogs being used as fashion items. So there is something incoherent about this. The public generally is not thinking very logically about human use of animals, and they have, to some extent, kind of singled out the use of non-human animals in sport. And I think this is a point which was made by J.M. Coetzee in relation to the use of animals for meat production in his excellent novella, The Lives of Animals. For those of you who haven't read it already, I highly recommend it. And the point he made was that really people aren't thinking about how the meat that's on their plate got there. I mean, they'd almost rather not know about that. And people often, not all people, obviously, some people think about that kind of thing very carefully and very seriously, but there are certainly some people who are not really thinking very logically about all human uses of non-human animals. And the important point for us, I think, is to my mind, there's nothing ethically distinct about using animals in sport compared to using them for actually any other use which humans put animals to. All human uses of animals put those animals at risk, whether we be using them in sport, whether we be using them for food production, whether we be using them as pets. I mean, we all have pet dogs, and generally speaking, there isn't much objection to that. Although, interestingly, I see in the Companions Animal New Zealand meeting in 10 days' time, one of the topics for debate is going to be whether or not it's going to be ethically acceptable to have companion animals in a few years' time. But at the moment, most of the public is not terribly concerned about that. We think it's quite reasonable to keep a dog as a pet. Well, dogs are actually pack animals, and the vast majority of them are kept as solitudinous animals and are left by their own for some hours each day and so forth. So that use of animals, and it is a use by humans of non-human animals, also has negative effects, or at least the potential for negative effects on the animals, as does using them in laboratory science, of course. And an argument that sometimes seems to be made around this is, but the use of animals in sport is trivial. It's not important. It's something we don't need to do, and therefore putting them at risk is not acceptable. But actually, all of these human uses of non-human animals, with the exception probably of using them in laboratory science to produce human medicines, are trivial. They're all things we don't really need to be doing. So I don't think that there is anything ethically distinct about using animals in sport. And I think that's something we need to be aware of when we involve ourselves in conversations around this. Now, the kind of argument which I've just made, that there's kind of nothing worse about using animals in sport than there is about having brachycephalic dogs as pets, for example, some people would say, well, that's a fallacious argument because two wrongs don't make a right. And if you take an absolutist animal rights point of view, and I mean animal rights here in a philosophical sense, a deontological rights-based view, not a kind of animal rights activist type of thing, but a philosophical approach to ethics, an absolutist animal rights point of view, as Tom Regan did, who you can see on the screen here, in which you think that sentient animals are subjects of a life, that they have interests in their own life, that they have certain rights which need to be respected, and that key amongst those is the right not to be injured or killed, and importantly, the not to have free choice limited by humans, then logically, of course, using animals in sport wouldn't be acceptable, and nor, in fact, would any of those other uses of animals which I've just described. So if that is your approach to ethics, to animal ethics, then yes, it is true. Two wrongs don't make a right, and you don't think any human use of non-human animals is ethically acceptable. And that is a perfectly valid philosophical approach. But it's not what the majority of society thinks at the moment. The majority of Western society, at least, does still think that it's acceptable to use animals, for example, as pets. Vegetarians and vegans are still not the majority, although, of course, an increasing number of people do have those dietary preferences, but a substantial number of people still think it's acceptable for us to use animals as a source of food. And yet many of those people don't think it's acceptable to be using animals in sport. So what is going on here? They haven't got an absolutist animal rights view of human use of non-human animals, and yet they're worried about using animals in sport. And that would include some of those internal stakeholders I was talking about at the beginning. So what's going on? I think what's going on is that the people who are expressing these concerns are wittingly or unwittingly undertaking what we call a utilitarian analysis of the use of animals in sport. So they're thinking about the harms and the benefits to animals, maybe to humans as well, of using non-human animals in sport, and they're weighing those up. And they're coming to the conclusion that the harms, or at least the potential harms, are outweighing the benefits. And this is a kind of utilitarian analysis, which was originally actually came from the work of Jeremy Bentham way back in 1789. And in those days, people weren't very concerned about animal welfare because they were kind of focused on the fact that animals, in their view, couldn't rationalize, didn't really reason, and therefore weren't important. And Bentham said, no, that's not what's important. What's important, the question is not whether they can reason, whether they can talk. The question is whether they can suffer. And of course, that's absolutely where we are at today. And it comes to the sentience point that Josh was talking about earlier. Nowadays, we think about animal welfare very much in terms of whether animals can suffer and their ability to experience, in fact, both negative and positive things. And of course, that's also the utilitarian view, which was further developed by Peter Singer, who you can also see here. And that, I think, is the way in which the majority of the public, and probably many of us in this room, are thinking about the use of animals in sport. We're thinking about the harms, we're thinking about the benefits, we're thinking about these sentient non-human animals' ability to experience their own lives, to experience both positive and negative effects. And we're saying, well, how do those weigh up? Can we justify using animals in sport? Do we think that overall, across the animal's life, the positive welfare effects are outweighing the negative ones? Because if not, then it's hard for us to justify continuing that use. And so we come back to the importance of minimizing negative welfare effects and maximizing positive welfare effects in order to be able to provide ethical justifications for using the animals in sport. And this is actually one of the three so-called central tenets of the ethical framework for the use of horses in sport, which World Horse Welfare kindly funded me to develop a few years ago, and which has been being developed and refined ever since. And for today's purposes, since we're talking not only about horses, but also about dogs in at least two types of sport, we can perhaps apply this framework to animals rather than just to horses. So it has these three central tenets, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes describing to you because I think and hope that they provide us, when we take them in combination with a way of explaining our ethical justifications for using animals, non-human animals, in sport. The first one I already covered. The next one is to do with identifying and mitigating avoidable unnecessary risks. So this idea of avoidable and unnecessary risk was first developed by Professor David Morton, who you can see on the screen here, in fact, in relation to laboratory animals. And essentially what it says is that there are risks which we can identify and which we then know what to do about. And where we can identify them and where we have a way of mitigating them, we must do so, because those are unnecessary risks in the sense that we can get rid of them or at least reduce them. And what we are left with when we've done that is just the unavoidable risks, those which are actually, it's necessary to take if we're going to continue to use animals in this particular way at all. So in David's example, it was to do with laboratory animals. In our example, it's to do with using animals in sport. So the idea for us would be that we try and through research, through policy development, keep identifying the risks to animals and keep mitigating them so that we kind of constantly drive down those avoidable risks and we keep getting left with the unavoidable ones. And then what we need to do is to make the unavoidable ones avoidable through research, through understanding what's causing them, through working out what we can do to mitigate them. And that way we keep hopefully kind of increasing the benefits and reducing the harms when we're doing that utilitarian analysis. And the question is, I suppose, from an ethical point of view, can we drive those avoidable risks out? Can we make enough unavoidable risks avoidable and get rid of them to kind of be at a level at which we think the unavoidable risks are ethically acceptable? And that is, I suppose, the level, at which society would think it's reasonable for the social license to use animals in sport to continue. Now, there's an interesting analogy here, actually, from motorsports, that those of you like myself who are in the room who are old enough to remember might recall that back in the 1970s, there was a spate of very horrible, high-profile crashes in Formula One motorsport, and to the point at which the social license for that sport to continue came under threat. It reached the point where everyone just thought, this is not actually acceptable. And what that sport then did was they undertook a massive amount of research, of policy development, and they made the sport safe enough that it kind of became okay for it to continue and the social license was maintained. And I think we're in a very similar position now. With the use of non-human animals in sport, that's what we need to do. We need to keep mitigating these risks. We need to be making the unavoidable ones avoidable through research, and that is how we will optimize welfare, safeguard welfare, and therefore keep our social license. And then the third central tenet is that governing body regulations and the law should be complied with, which sounds like a kind of fairly low bar, but it is a really necessary one. And it is really important that the pressure to do that comes from internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders, so that those who are concerned about optimizing welfare of non-human animals being used in sport make sure that when individual stakeholders fail to reach the standards which we think are necessary, they are identified as being kind of rotten apples, as their behavior not being the acceptable norm, and they are dealt with appropriately by the regulatory authorities. So I think that these central tenets of the ethical framework together kind of help us to explain why we think that the use of animals in sport is ethically justifiable, not only to external stakeholders, but also to those internal stakeholders who are concerned about welfare impacts. So those people who don't fundamentally disapprove of using non-human animals in sport, but who worry about that balance of harms and benefits. And that brings us back to this kind of interplay between welfare and ethics. Now, we need to talk about ethics, and I've spent quite a lot of time, I've tried not to kind of go diverging too much into ethical theories, because that's a whole different lecture, but I have talked quite a lot about ethics and about how we can explain our ethical justifications for using non-human animals in competitive sport. And I think it's really important that we start to do that now in the public sphere. We're at a moment in time, it seems to me, and Josh described it earlier, as this kind of moment from which we hope to go forwards now with all of you into the future in collaboration. We're at a moment in time when a lot of work has been done around welfare across sports, across species. The FEI Commission work is one example of that. The work that's been going on internationally in greyhound racing is another example of that. The work that's been going on with sled dogs is a further example of that. There's all this work being going on about welfare, and that's good. And I do believe absolutely it is a necessary prerequisite for being able to ethically justify the use of animals in sport. But I think it's almost not enough, because nonetheless, notwithstanding all of that work, and we all know where we are with that work as internal stakeholders, the public conversation, what is being heard in the public space still a lot, and notwithstanding what has been going on with that welfare work, there are individuals and organizations who are choosing, in my view, quite deliberately actually, to ignore a lot of that very positive work around welfare of the animals being used in sport, and just keep reiterating in the public space that the use of non-human animals in competitive sport is unethical, without actually providing very complex explanations for that assertion. And I think we need now, at this moment in time when we've been doing that welfare work, where we want to move forwards, I think we need to engage in that conversation and to be more proactive about explaining our ethical justifications for the continued use of animals in competitive sport. And there's this article I published on this last year, if you're interested, it explains in some detail about how we can justify that in terms of each of the ethical theories. But I hope what I've been talking about for the last few minutes provides you with a basis for explaining how welfare informs ethical decision-making, and those three central points about our ethical justifications for using animals in sport, which are based in optimizing and safeguarding and protecting welfare. This says a bit more about the ethical framework for the use of animals in sport. If you're interested in it, as I said, its original development was kindly funded by World Horse Welfare, and they are also now funding PhD student Bluebell Brown, who is supervised by myself and Professor Verheyen and Dr. Cardwell. And she is now developing it for use at grassroots level. And I'm not going to say any more about it today, because that's kind of not the purpose of the talk, other than to say that it does provide a logical and transparent method of ethical decision making, and it's one which we can apply across species and across sports. And I think that is an important point. It doesn't have to be this framework, but I think it is helpful when we're all talking together in collaboration across our sports and the public space about our ethical justifications for using non-human animals in sport. If we can talk in a similar fashion, if we can explain things in a similar way and in a very transparent way and in a very logical way that demonstrates that animal welfare is the heart of our decision-making processes, which it is. Because if we are able to do that consistently, it's much easier for the public to understand than if we're all having slightly bit-mill conversations. And that's a link to it, if any of you are interested afterwards. So I think we need to talk about ethics very proactively. And I think how we talk about ethics also matters. Something that I've been saying for a little while now is that I think it's really important that when we are speaking in the public space, we are very clear that we are concerned about welfare for its own sake, because it's the right thing to do. And I know that's true myself as an internal stakeholder across sports and across species. I know that is true, that there are lots of people within these sports who are genuinely very passionate about optimizing and protecting and safeguarding animal welfare. But I do worry a little bit that we've become so engaged in this conversation about social license, and it has been a necessary engagement, absolutely, that we sometimes, it almost sounds as if what we're concerned about is maintaining the social license rather than the welfare. And that, of course, is back to front. What we're concerned about genuinely is the welfare. And if we get the welfare right, then the social license will follow. But we need to be clear when we're speaking that the social license following is the kind of side effect. It's not our aim. I also think the language we use when we talk about animal ethics is important. So when I first started speaking about this a few years ago, I used to hear things coming back at me like, oh, well, you know, you can tell that horses love to run because if the jockey falls off, they keep on racing. Well, of course, they keep on racing. You know, they're herd animals. Their instinct is to keep following the herd. So I don't, think that's a helpful argument. And I think it's, the way in which thinking around animal ethics has developed for the last decade about the way in which the public has engaged in that thinking, I don't think it's helpful for us to be kind of coming up with those rather trite sayings. And another similar one is, these competition horses, they're best looked after horses in the world. They get everything they could possibly need. And I've put two pictures up here. I've very carefully taken one from an advert for stables because I didn't want to put anyone's particular stable up there. But the point I'm making is, a lot of these competition horses, and one of the things the FEI Commission talked about was kind of the other 23 hours, the hour a day when the horse is not out of its stable being worked. Are their welfare needs being met for those other 23 hours? And they may be in very beautifully designed stables. But as a friend of mine said to me when she bought her horse to stay with us for breeding purposes, effectively, however beautiful these stables are, they are just cages that we're keeping them in. And that is actually true. And so, we can look at these very beautiful stables. We can look at my own two horses on the left here. This is what it looks like in Sussex in England, half the way through the winter. It's even worse now from a muddy point of view. But I think that those horses are having their welfare needs better met by living out all the time, despite the weather, than they are standing in a stable for 23 hours a day, which is somewhat frustrating because I also spent a lot of money in expensive stables some years ago, and now I barely use them. But nonetheless, one's changing things as time goes by, and we need to challenge ourselves to take on board the developing welfare science and to really think about whether we're meeting animals' welfare needs and to be careful about the language we're using to describe those. When we're engaging in this conversation about the ethical use of animals, we need to take other people's views seriously and respectfully. We must be prepared to challenge ourselves, like I just said, the way in which we keep our horses at a very individual level. But things change over time. When I was a child, I used to get taken by my grandmother to the dolphinarium in Brighton, and we used to spend happy afternoons watching these poor dolphins jump through hoops in a space which was probably from here to that side of the room. Nowadays, no one finds that ethically acceptable. In those days, we thought it was fabulous. And I was in a meeting last week when we were talking about farrowing crates for sows, and someone in that meeting said, I think it's not going to be that long before we're looking back to this moment in time and thinking, how can we possibly have thought it was acceptable to keep pigs in that way? So things change over time. All of us need to be prepared to listen to other points of view and to challenge ourselves about whether actually the way in which we've done things is always the right way to do things, about whether what we're doing is ethically acceptable. And to be prepared to accept those challenges. One of the great things about teaching is that I quite often get challenged by my own students to think about the way in which I do things. And that applies to, when I was in reproductive practice, applied to that quite often. And it's really good to have that challenge. And we need to be open to doing that. And we need to understand that talking about that is not a sign of weakness, quite the opposite. To be able to talk about things and to listen respectfully to challenges and then to consider them is actually a sign of strength. And it will protect us as we go forwards. And then the language we use is important. So another thing I've been challenged by my own students on is talking about farm animals, for example. They said, well, why are you calling the cow it? It's not it, it's she. Quite right. That pulled me up short. I've tried throughout this talk, although it's a bit of a long thing to get out, but I've tried to talk about non-human animals rather than just about animals, because of course we are animals too. And we increasingly understand that. And so it's good to talk about non-human animals. One of the things we had a lot of discussion about as we were working on the FEI Commission was this idea of partnerships. Is there a horse-human partnership? Well, I don't think there is, personally. That's my own personal view. But no, we interact with horses. Certainly we communicate with them. Those of us, and there are many of us, myself included in this room, who are with horses a lot, we know how special that relationship is, but it's not an equal partnership, really. We put the tack on the horse, we tell it what we're going to do each day. And so personally, I think to use the term partnership is somewhat disingenuous, and I think it's unhelpful. And I think it's better to talk about an interaction or a relationship. And then there's the use of this word use, which I have very deliberately been using throughout this talk. And again, that's something people can say, it's a bit of a challenging word. Why are you talking about use? Can't we find a different way of describing that? And again, I think it's disingenuous to try and describe it in a different way. Humans do use non-human animals, and we need to be upfront about that, I think. And then we need to explain why we think that's ethically justifiable and the systems we have in place to protect welfare appropriately in order to make it ethically justifiable. The final point I wanted to finish up with, and it's interesting because Josh and I actually hadn't compared what we were going to speak about before we started, but I am about to end on almost the point on which he began, by saying that the conversation we're having here today about the use of animals in sport is actually not one we're having in a vacuum. It's one to do with a much larger societal conversation and consideration about the interaction between humans and non-human animals, and how all of those animals are part of the environment and the ecosystem. And Josh spoke very well, and I agree with him about First Nations people and the way in which they have been very aware of this forever, and the way in which we are late to the game in our discussions. But it is a discussion that now is starting to happen, and this very nice diagrammatic illustration of it is taken from the paper you can see here, which appropriately, given where we are, is actually about animal welfare and bushfires. But it just demonstrates, I think, how really it's all to do with one welfare. And that's the way I think in which we need to be thinking as we go forward and have this conversation about our own particular sectors. Finally, I couldn't finish having showed you a picture of my horses without showing you a picture of my greyhound. So this is my first retired greyhound, Bertie. That's it, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Maddie, thank you very much. Terrific as always, and thought-provoking. Some very important information there for the rest of the day. I think that point about one welfare, is key. and also the importance of trying to unpack some of these deceptively simple questions, like, is it ethical to use animals? I mean, that's a complicated question, so thank you. Now, we've got time for, I think, 2 quick questions. Julie will bring the microphone round so our audience online can hear your question.
Thanks, Dr. Campbell, for your presentation, and agree with the engaging with people on this issue for sure. I just had a question about, you made a comment about then being nothing ethically distinct about the use of animals in sport compared to other animal uses. And just wondering how that fits, you know, even with something like a utilitarian framework, we have risks and benefits, or, you know, negative and positive welfare impacts, which differ between industries and even between different sports uses. Sure. So how do those two marry up?
So I think the point I'm trying to make is that, and I completely agree, of course, there are different harms and benefits across sports and so forth, is that actually there are harms and benefits, whatever the use of humans. And the only example really in which I think the benefits are so substantial to humans that they would outweigh and do outweigh quite negative welfare effects on non-human animals, albeit, of course, we try to minimize those, is when we're using animals in biomedical science. But other than that, there is, you know, we are always, or very often, doing what Singer, of course, said we shouldn't do without thinking about it, which is allowing human interests to trump animal interests. And the point I'm making really is that we're not doing that uniquely when we're using animals in sport. We're doing it across uses of animals. Does that answer the question, or do you want to elaborate a bit more on your thinking on it?
My name's Madeleine from RSPCA Australia. So I guess the level of harm and benefit is ethically relevant. So sure. So there is sure. ethically a difference between each animal use, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree. The level of harm and benefit is ethically relevant, absolutely. And this is, you know, there are some harms, and this is something actually in other work I do, we've been thinking about quite a lot. You know, there may be some harms which are so severe, and that may be in terms of duration, or it may be just in terms of severity, that actually we don't find those ethically acceptable, whatever the benefit to humans would be. So to take one example of that, in British policy, with a very specific exception in European legislation, we don't allow the use of great apes in biomedical research, because our understanding of their cognitive ability is that the harms to them would be so great that however wonderful the benefit to humans might be of using them as experimental models, that's just not deemed acceptable. So I agree, it's a level of harm that's ethically relevant, yeah.
Alan Youngman, Animal Welfare Science Centre. I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about, you talked about the order 23 hours if we use a horse for 1 hour. But is that really, I mean, that's part of the lifestyle and part of that we should consider. We should consider the full 24 hours. But I don't think you should separate necessarily the 23 hours from the 1 hour that you use the animal.
Okay.
Correct? Like, as in, whatever we do in that 1 hour, it may have a perfect life 23 hours, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't minimize the welfare impacts during that 1 hour.
Oh no, I agree with that completely. I completely agree with that. I was almost, I think, thinking it the other way around. Is there's no good only concentrating on that 1 hour and not worrying about the fact the horse is standing in the stable for the other 23. So yeah, but yeah, we need to be thinking about it holistically. Absolutely, we need to be trying to meet the animal's welfare needs throughout the 24 hours.
Because I mean, you gave a little bit the impression if we did really well for the animal for 23 hours, then
then the 1 hour wouldn't matter. No, sorry, that wasn't what I meant to say at all. It was the opposite. It was at doing, I think the focus, and certainly the media focus, you know, and we think back to how influential that was in that World Horse Welfare Survey about how people thought about things. We think back to how, in that example of the Grand National, is the fact people could suddenly see on television what was going on that made such a difference. The media focus tends to be inevitably on the 1 hour, you know, when the horses are in the competitive arena. But it's the idea of iceberg indicators, isn't it? That's only the tip of the iceberg, you know, that's the visible bit. But the 23 hours is the rest of the iceberg, as you know, that Christopher Roth has described under the water level. which is the rest of the animal's experience. So yeah, if I gave that impression, that I meant it the other way around, and I apologize.
Thank you. Maddie, we do have one question online, which I'll take before we move on. This is an interesting one. So it relates to the utilitarian calculation of a good life that you talked about, and the concept that overall we need more positive experiences than negative. And the question is, how much evidence is there that animals have these mental capacities, and how can these be factored into the calculation about a good life? And the question goes on to ask whether actually the concept of a good life is one that makes it justifiable for us humans to make that reflection that the animal is having a good life. And I hope I did the question justice, Christina. Thank you for the question.
So I'm going to slightly pass that on to you, because it's kind of what you're going to be talking about in a few minutes' time a little bit. But to answer the question in broad terms, where do we get that evidence from? I think we need to be looking as well as to welfare science, to behavioural science, and we have an increasing amount of evidence around that.
And that is the perfect introduction to what I'm going to talk about. So here's another deceptively simple question. Can animals in sport have positive experiences? And we put this question in purposefully at this point because it's something we're going to think about a lot today. It's pretty central to the reason why we're here. And I don't think we have the answer to this question, but the purpose of this talk is to unpack a bit what this question actually means, what we need to know and what we need to be thinking about to answer it. And perhaps think about where we are at the moment in terms of being able to really answer this question, and then taking that future focus, think about where next. But yes, Maddie's setup for this is perfect. It's thinking beyond our traditional science methods, which I'll explain are pretty limited when it comes to answering this question. Think about, okay, well, what else can we do to try to understand this question? I'm taking a high risk here. I thought we could try some questions and just get your views. So if you get your phones out and point it at that QR code, if the IT is with us, that should take you to a Mentimeter site, which will open on your phone. It might take 2 or 3 seconds to open. And you'll be able to answer the question. So this is the kind of simplistic question that Maddie was referring to with ethics. So can animals in sport have positive experience? And perhaps answer this from what you think the viewpoints and perspectives of the members of your organisation or sport participants think. It's the kind of question that we'll think about the public in a second. It tends to get a sort of a gut feeling response from many people outside of the sector. And I'd just be really interested to see what you think. So we've got yes all of the time, yes some of the time, sometimes, or never. And this is all about perceptions, because as I say, I don't think we have a great way of actually measuring this at the moment. So pretty good consensus there. We're thinking that yes for some of the time. All right, well, thank you for that. Let's move on and ask the same question again. Your phones will update in just a second. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I'll pause. I'm sorry. Oh, apologies. How many people haven't been able to connect? A few of you. And is that because of slow Wi-Fi connection? Okay. I'll hang on for a few seconds. Julie, have we distributed the guest Wi-Fi link? As if by magic. Yes, so the username for the Wi-Fi, guest Wi-Fi is eSymposium. eSymposium, if you look on your Wi-Fi list. And the password for eSymposium is at lowercase c 6 lowercase k uppercase h 8. So at C6K uppercase H8.
So just a quick question. That is yes, some of the time.
Well, okay. Sometimes would be occasionally, you know, generally not, perhaps.
Is there a way of giving us got through the?
Yes. So if you go to menti.com and then put in the code that's at the top of the screen, 3322 4677. These things never quite go according to plan, but at least some of you have been able to join. And again, we have some evidence about what the public think, and Maddie's slides, which would be principally UK audience, I would guess, or would they be an international audience? International, yeah. So, you know, there is a difference in between what we believe and what the public can believe. I'm sure, as you're saying here now, that some of the public will be thinking the same things as us, but we know some of the public are definitely not thinking the same things as us. So that's relevant for thinking about that future focus for later. Now let's just try some other ideas. I would be keen to get your views about what we think the public view is about horses in sport at their home stable or yard. So away from competition, so away from the racetrack or the event or wherever it is. What do we think? So again, apologies if I've not chosen great words, but yes, most or all the time, yes, sometimes, seldom or rarely, or actually we're not sure the public really worry about the horse's experience out of the public eye, as it were, out of the TV. So when the horse is back at the home stable yard. Yeah, so I think that's interesting. That would be my view too. I think for horses, I'm not sure that the public give a huge amount of thought to what happens outside of the public eye in competition. So thank you for that. Now, what about this one? How about if we think about racing greyhounds? And apologies to the sled dog community. I've not put a question in about sled dogs, but what do the public think about positive experience for racing greyhounds at the home kennel? It's interesting to think about, isn't it? So if I just go back a slide, then here's what we thought for horses at home, and positive, and actually maybe a lot of the public don't really think about this, but our view for greyhounds at home is somewhat different. And that's what I think I would have, I mean, Maddie's the expert, but you know, I think
Well, I think in some moments in time, there is a media event which makes people suddenly think about a training method, for example, being used outside of competition, but generally speaking, I agree.
Yeah. So again, worth thinking about. We take our future focus and to take that view across our sports. What do we need to think about at competition and also out of competition? And then the last thing, so you can type words in here. And I think that to start to understand the question a bit more, can animals have positive experience? We actually need some underpinning knowledge or assumptions. Back to Maddie's question about ethics. We can't answer this, and we can't let the public debate be a matter of emotion or gut reaction. So perhaps just think about, if we're going to really engage with this question, thinking about mental states, and that's what we mean by positive experience, mental states. What underpinning knowledge or assumptions do we need to have or be thinking about or using to really start to understand what this question requires. Yep, brilliant. Keep going. I like all of these. So measures of stress, absolutely. We'll talk about that. Acceptable thresholds, yes. Key concepts. Frameworks for assessment. Thank you for putting that one in. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Behavioral indications. Know how animals show they're having a positive experience. And that's a great one. If the person that contributed that is comfortable, could you say a little bit more about how we might know the animals? What, how could we?
Thank you. My name's Stella and I'm from Racing Victoria. When I've written that down there, if I think about, we explain that they do, we've got to think about, well, how do we know that? And that comes through behavioural science.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
As Maddie had set up for us. So we need means of observing the animal and then making inferences about what do we think that behavior means, and do we think that indicates a positive experience, a positive mental state. Minimal standards, absolutely. Reading body language, very much along the lines with you. Physiological assessments, yes, and that's where we have been. And I'd like to think about the pros and cons, or the limitations and advantages of physiological assessments. Another framework reference, 5 domains. Changes in behavior, mental health needs, what a happy animal actually looks like. Now, I love that whoever put that in has used the word happy. It's not many years ago when it would have been, I think, scientifically unacceptable to talk about happy. We'd use other words. But actually, we're sort of moving on, and you'll come across this idea of, in thinking about this, we need to bridge from our traditional quantitative science base. We can measure things, we can observe things, and perhaps take that leap of faith into the more qualitative world and think of things a little bit differently. Now that's a stretch, and it does cause some tension in animal science, but this is what, so you've absolutely nailed it there. Thank you. We'll hang on to that slide. So I'll just say a few words, and then I'll wrap up. Now, in fact, as you've touched on, we cannot think about positive experience unless we have an understanding of and an acceptance of animal sentience and agency. Julie's going to touch on those in her talk a little bit. And we also need, importantly, not just to understand this and accept it, but a willingness to adopt practices that recognize both of these. And if you think about it, the previous concepts of welfare, and we had contributions from about 5 domains. What was the sort of framework that you'd have probably worked in pre-5 domains? 5 freedoms, right. Served us well, and I'll say a few words about that. Served us well, but we need, and we have moved on. So we need to move on from those sort of 5 freedom-based concepts of welfare. It's really focused on physical health, ability to cope with the environment, and minimizing negative effects, negative experiences, which actually are really survival critical things. Thirst, hunger, temperature, that sort of thing. And as Matt introduced very nicely, current concepts are really all about recognizing that animals, firstly, are sentient, and because of that, are capable of experiencing positive and negative emotions and experiences or effects. And the big shift in recent years has been recognizing that when we talk about a good life, which we still don't really have a tight definition for, and I think the question from Christina's side to unpack that a little bit, but whatever we end up landing on for what a good life means, it cannot be achieved simply by avoiding negative experiences. That's not enough. We actually need to shift, and many of you in the room have already made this shift to thinking about, okay, well, what can we do to provide the animal with mainly positive experiences through its life? And here's words again we would not have used until recently: pleasure, reward, achievement, happiness. And so really, when we think about what we're doing on the ground, our practices need to shift, and are shifting from care, meaning how we manage the horse, its environment, its feed, and so on, to doing that, but also promoting its psychological well-being, because that's what we mean by positive mental states, experiences, or effects. They're all really interchangeable ideas. Sorry, on the wrong computer there. Now we'll skip over that one. So we talked about the 5 freedoms, great model introduced in the 1990s. It served us very well. It moved animal welfare onto a platform where we could actually think about it in clear terms. What it really does, though, is focus on minimizing rather than eliminating, but minimizing the survival critical negative experience: hunger, thirst, pain, injury, disease, fear, distress, discomfort, and so on. What it doesn't do is think about the animal's external experiences, how they impact its mental state. So that really means its interactions with other animals, interactions with people, interactions with the environment. And we're all familiar with the 5 domains model. And of course, that's exactly what the 5 domains model does. It recognizes that nutrition, environment, health, which are those survival critical requirements, are important. We also need then to think about the external influences on the animal's mental state, its behavioral interactions with other animals, with people, and its environment. And that all of these result in the endpoint mental state, and it's the mental state which is welfare. And I think this graphic from World Horse Welfare shows this very nicely. There's lots of ways of representing this, but this is the big shift. So the key thing is this idea of behavioral interactions. This is really the big thing which the 5 domains introduced. We've talked about agency, and the key thing with behavioral interactions, as we've had from you in the audience, is that this is the animal's opportunity to exercise agency. It's opportunity to make conscious choices and do things in order to achieve a goal. And agency is key in this thinking about how do we think about mental experience, because agency is the gateway for assessing and understanding positive welfare. And why is that? Well, it's because if we know what we're looking at, and we need the tools to actually do this in a repeatable way, but if we know what we're looking at, then the animal's positive or negative emotions can be inferred from what we observe it doing, its agency-related behaviors, and what we think that means. And so actually agency provides a way of assessing positive mental experience. There may be other ways too, but this is a really important way. And it's a big move on for science from thinking about physiological measures, heart rate, body weight, appetite, food intake, cortisol, all those things that we used to. This is a different way of thinking. I won't go through all these, but I just copied out 2 of the very nice examples from David Mellor's 5 domains paper. You'll all be familiar with this, but this is the sort of thinking we need, where on the left, we've got examples of what we do, which will either allow or not allow agency, and then how that might produce negative experiences in red or positive experiences on the right. So for example, being in a barren, boring environment creates boredom, helplessness, depression, and withdrawal, whereas a varied, novel environment creates an interested animal which is pleasantly occupied. Or animals which are facing significant threats will have anxiety and fear and anger, whereas removing those will produce a sense of being secure, protected, and confident. And perhaps more relevant for us now are interactions with humans, because that's what we do in sport. And so here's some examples, and I won't read them out again, but again, some thoughts from David about the kind of interactions that animals might have with us, how we behave around them that can result in negative outcomes, and those that can result in positive outcomes. Now we're talking about sport, so let's think about what could this mean for us? What could this mean for training methods? What could this mean for competition? And this is where incorporating another relatively new discipline, animal learning theory, becomes so important, because we know a lot now about what animals learn and how they respond mentally when they're learning. So maybe it's time to start thinking, and many of you are, about positive reinforcement methods during training, making training a positive learning exercise. Animals like to learn. Horses love to acquire new skills, new competencies. Let's make learning a cognitive activity which produces mental rewards. Lots of things we can be thinking about. We're doing it in small ways, but when we get to the workshop this afternoon, this is really the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. So 2 more slides, then I'll stop. So the problem with all of this, which is really at the root of Christina's question online, is that we can't measure mental experience. I can't measure your mental experience. You can tell me about it. I can't measure a horse or a dog's mental experience, and they can't tell us about it. And that's because they're felt by that individual animal. They're unique to that animal. They're subjective. But what we can do using, say, behavioral measures and maybe other measures in the future, looking at what the animal's doing, we can maybe cautiously infer what we think that behavior means. And does this indicate a positive or negative state? And so there's lots of welfare indicators that we have used. That traditionally we thought about, okay, how adequate are the resources we're providing, food, water, shelter, how adequate are management and training practices. We've got animal-based measures, physiology, which actually are very limited and really tell us only about negative states, things like cortisol, heart rate. Behavioral measures, and that's all about agency, which I think give the opportunity to think about mental states and positive experiences. And a bit for the future, maybe there's biomarkers, maybe there's things we can measure in blood. We all know about oxytocin, that's the pleasure hormone, the feel-good hormone. Maybe there's an opportunity there. And there's a growing field of measuring brain-related chemicals in blood that maybe in the future might give us some more objective measures. But right now, it's all about behavioral measures and thinking about agency. And we've got a number of these, of course, which are well in use, things like qualitative behavioral assessments and the animal welfare indicator tools, which many of you will be familiar with and use. So I'm going to stop at this point and just summarize by saying that this is a complicated but deceptively simple question. To engage with this, we need an underpinning acceptance and understanding of sentience and agency. And it also requires a fundamental shift in thinking from 5 freedoms to 5 domains. And the fact that a good welfare state means an overall positive mental state. And this means how the animal experiences their life. And this is not just about minimizing negative experience, it's about providing opportunities for positive mental experiences. And it is the case that assessing or measuring positive mental state is a challenge, but we do have some tools which are now becoming validated and accepted, and we're starting to use them. And so now we can start to think a bit better about what a good life means, but we still are not able to really agree the methods to quantify it. And so we started with this question: can animals in sport have positive experience? Now, my proposition for today is that we reframe this question to this. Rather than that simple question, can animals in sport have positive experience? I think the question is, how can we, and you as leaders, embed sentience-informed and agency-enabling environmental management and training or competition practices into our sports disciplines and sectors? And that's quite a big one to think about. And how can we assess this and provide evidence that we are providing opportunities for a net positive experience for our animals? And so I'll stop at that point, and I hope that's a useful setup for what's to follow. And I'm now going to hand on to my colleague, Julie Fiedler, who's been working with me on a PhD project, actually looking at many of these questions. She'll be well known to many of you. She's a well-known figure in the Australian horse area, having served with Horse SA for 20 years. And Julie's been working with me for the last 4 years on many of the questions that we're looking at today, in particular this idea of a future focus for horse welfare. So Julie, thank you for talking, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming many thousands of miles, some of you guys. It's really great to have you here today. I'll just do a very short presentation, mainly because it's coffee break soon. But also it's just really to bring some ideas forward that we'd love you to have a bit more of a chat about this afternoon. So as Josh mentioned eloquently in his opening, I also always acknowledge, because my project is about sentience and agency, that this knowledge sits very deeply within many First Nations cultures and is coming quite late to westernised cultures. 2 quick items, but Maddie has covered off on social licence to operate, so that will be a very short talk, and then I'll go into safeguarding. One reason that brings us to the room today is that there is a changing public attitude. We can feel it. We can bring out newspapers and magazines from 2 years ago, and then what's headlines back then is very different to what's headlines today, and the speed of those headlines going viral. So, and one of those things is because more people, or the public, understand that animals can think and feel, so they're sentient, and that brings with it expectations for care. Now, the Victorian government has responded and is bringing sentience into law in Victoria, and you've got until the 25th of March to respond to that. I'll get to that slide. But also I saw on my feed the other day, South Australia is going to introduce a bill for the same thing. So that won't take long to move around the country. And the other thing is with social licence is the idea of public trust. The public needs to trust people and organisations that good well-being or welfare will take place even when nobody is looking. So as Josh mentioned, I'll just pull one quote from thousands of quotes that have come through the Future Horse Project. But this person, respondent, realises that all social licence affects the way we approach how horses are prepared and cared for. That includes the stable staff, the trainers, the stewards. Everybody has to work as a team. And even in a meeting yesterday that I was in with Karen, we were heard about how all the organisations that are being set up, it's a new national framework for vocational training and workforce. All organisations have to help other organisations meet a standard. If one organisation falls down or is not perceived to be meeting a standard, the public thinks it's all the others as well. Okay, so we have to work together to collectively hold our standards up. So social licence, as Maddie's pointed out, so it's trust, credibility and legitimacy. But we've got some really good authors in the room that have written papers on this, so I won't spend too long there. That was the Adelaide International 3-day event, but absolutely classic photo. So people are no longer opening up the newspaper and reading the news. We are all newsmakers. If you post something on Facebook, you are a newsmaker. Okay. And then that news in its new form can be traded. Who knows who saw what? Did you see this? Okay, it's traded like currency. It has value. So another talk I do, I often talk about a digital hoof print, because whatever photos taken, whether the horse is looking brilliant or the horse is not looking so brilliant, it's online forever. Okay. So it's just keep that in the back of your mind. Probably an important point for many of the regulatory delegates in the room today. Another thing that's changed probably is some of the pressure you might feel about decision making in public space, because those decisions are judged online in real time, as well as by people that might be there on the ground. Okay, so I call it decision making in the company of the public, the real and the virtual public. So there's a very high risk for a misalignment between the intent of the veterinarian and as Maddie said, to make animal welfare decisions and what the public's thinking of those horses going around the jump. Good photo. But importantly, social licence is a concept that rests with the public. Okay, we have the responsibility for animal welfare and wellbeing and working with our stakeholders and other organisations to do that. Okay, so just for a few minutes before we go for a break, we'll just have a talk about the concept of safeguarding. Now, it's one of these words that's used in lots of different ways. And there's also legal versions of the word as well. So what I'm proposing is that animal organisations start thinking about what does safeguarding mean for us, okay, in our world. What does it mean in the world of sports? Now, we're all used to the idea of child safeguarding in sports, and British Equestrian got quite a nice page on that. Don't look too far for it. But it's any person in the community that might not be able to advocate for themselves. So we've had a Royal Commission into Disability in Australia, okay? Or aged care homes, another situation. So it's anywhere that humans can't advocate for themselves, that humans take a safeguarding approach. Now, children in sport's an easy one. But it's the same with horses. I'll walk around the university here last year and I saw safeguarding our national dairy herd. I went, ooh, that's exciting. So same principles, but how are we going to apply that for animals in sport? We're taking animals into situations that are outside of their home environment. So giving Victorian government a plug here. So you have a few more days to have a think about what it might mean for animal sentience in law coming into Victoria. But as I also saw online the other night, South Australia won't be far behind. It is having a look at more than minimum legal requirements. And in the consultation documents, if they're still online, if you go back, have a look, the concept of sentience and safeguarding are connected in a legal sense. And I would encourage everybody to think, well, what does it mean in a community sense? What does it mean for us in a broader context? We don't want to be live in a legal corridor. So moving on quickly to, well, Josh has covered this. Thank you, sir. Mate, very quick. So we've traditionally spent all of our life on the health, nutrition, physical environment. Okay, that's all farm animal welfare is long history in that. And that's where the 5 freedoms came out of, is farm animal intensive management. And the 5 domains brings to us this behavioural interactions, and it brings to us situation-related experiences. So situations, interactions. If this comes from the social sciences, situated experiences are well embedded. So it's the interaction of people with other people, sort of thing. So it's understanding that those experiences can either be internal or innate or something, I'm thirsty. Okay, the animal doesn't have much control over that. But they will have some control over their situation or how they interact with you. Okay. So I've had this drawn up just to keep you thinking. I did start this originally. Josh might have saw an early version. I had lines going everywhere. Just got too much. Really, it's just to be a discussion point, and it's a lovely picture to have in a workshop and get people to start talking about, well, I've taken my horse out of the home environment. How many more people, how many different experiences? What am I asking them to do in a very short time? Step out the float, put the saddle on, let's perform. That is almost no adaptation time. Can't think of any other species that would have to do the same thing. Just keep dog people happy. Okay, similar thing for greyhounds. So any sport can create or draw up your own sort of similar exercises. And it helps thinking, because thinking is so entrenched in the home stable environment. Most research to date has been in the animal's living environment. Very little research out on the sporting field, okay, and out on the track that is to do with human-animal interaction, okay. So just coming towards the safety net. So what I would like to get across today is that there's more than one person, e.g. the animal's owner, that is responsible for how that animal experiences that event. So we're traditionally taught to think, well, that person's responsible for that animal and they should make it stand still and do whatever, okay? But we need to move on from that and think, well, as event organisers, as other people at the event, we all have a responsibility towards every animal that's there. Now, we can have a responsibility in person, but also as part of the wider safety net, and you're into bedtime reading, have a think about the different acts and policies and codes, which may be voluntary or mandatory, that also indirectly impact how that animal may feel or may experience that event. Now, that is a whole day workshop just on that slide. But that's, again, just thinking about, well, how do we join up and work together to make sure every animal experiences that event positively. So I've just put that together quickly into something called Animal Safeguarding for Organisations. I just read the human side of things, how to look at some keywords, how to look at the work I was doing, the PhD project, chats with Josh, and came up with these kind of headings, but they are examples and different organisations may choose to have their own. Culture is quite important because it's an enabler. You can have all the policies and rule books in the world, but unless culture is positive, rules will be avoided, ignored, or tokenistic. It'll be hard work for the people that have to enforce the rules. So culture is really important. I'm hoping you can read, because I'm not going to read it all out. Okay, but it is being recorded and you're welcome to go back and have a look. So Josh has covered off on the 5 domains, fortunately. Maddie's already touched on language. It's important that we don't objectify animals, but also too, sometimes there's silence, which could be also cause its own problems. Proportionate. Anybody that's had to run a budget will be right on top of this. Okay, but it's important to understand that it's not only fiscal decision making that's sitting behind why your event or why you've chosen to do one thing over another. It's part of what Maddie was talking about today. Understand the why. Okay, and one I always bring up with Josh is the biosecurity one, because so it's all about isolating the horse, keep horses apart for the herd health, and that's fine. Biosecurity expert over there as well. But our activities have developed over the years, and have we thought about how we can introduce, how we can have some sort of social engagement for the animals in a high health status? Okay, our venues are not, they're sold at, sold as really good dressage arenas, top surface on the racetrack. Wouldn't it be great if we had, like, as well as 5-star dressage arena, we had 5-star social engagement equipment, or things that you could take your horse and have some, could rub and scratch, because there's 23 hours in the stable. And that's infrastructure. That's an easy thing to do. Okay, but our venues are not designed like that. We haven't thought like that. But that's just one option. Okay, collaborative care. We'll hopefully have a lot more chat about that this afternoon. But that's together we're working, together we're decision making, and you'll hear a bit more about that on the panel. And then we must be solution orientated. It's not about avoiding suffering and cruelty. It's what can we do to provide positive experiences? What are the solutions? How do we implement it? And please celebrate tiny successes, because they're so hard to bring forward in organisations sometimes. And accountability. There's plenty of stewards in the room today. So you'll be right across that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Brilliant follow on from Maddie's talk. Great link into mine, and very much that future focus. And that idea of safeguarding is one of these sort of future ideas that we really want to explore a bit more during the later sessions. So, Julie, you brought us perfectly to time. Thank you. Are there any questions that we can answer to make this morning's session more complete before we go into the short coffee break and then come back for the panel? Let's go to Graham first, then we'll come back to you, Ellen. No, we'll go to Graham first. Graham just had his hand up ahead of Ellen.
Yeah. Graham Cook, I was a director of the FBI, and then I was on the board of a horse charity in Brook. I'm currently a CEO for it. It's a question for you all. When I was doing the FBI role, I was always amazed at the different cultures in different parts of the world. So one part of the world, you would do whatever you had to do to the horse because the horse is on the team, even though on the outside it seemed to be detrimental practices. And another side, Holland or Germany, if you had to do anything to the horse, it was akin to child abuse because the horse was a child. And in other parts of the world, the horse was a gift from God, and therefore there was entitlement to do as you wish beyond criticism to any animal. So you talked about culture, and I really value your own thoughts on that in terms of some of the ideas.
Yeah, brilliant question. I'll ask Maddie to lead off on that. Just a personal thought. We're all of like mind, I think, in this call, both in the room and online, but we're about thinking internationally here, and that is such an important contextual question for us. But Maddie,
no, I agree with what you just said as well, and Graham's absolutely right. It is a challenge, and I was aware of that when I was sitting on the FEI commission as well. And in fact, that the awareness of that challenge is collaboration, because we like to engage with collaboration, we can get those things going. And that actually one of the reasons for having this event today is hoping that you in this room will go back to your organisations, different countries and different sectors, and will be able to act as leaders in helping to engage more and more people in this conversation. And one of the things I hope we'll be able to do will be identify people all across the world who can take on that leadership role.
right, and I think we should unpack that a little bit more as the day goes on. Key question. We'll take the last question from Ellen, and then we'll go for a well-earned coffee break.
Yeah, probably more a comment than necessarily a question. I know we're all enthusiastic now about including positive emotions and positive experience for animals. But I think particularly when we look at animals in sport, there is still a lot of negative things, like even Julie showing up, animals coming out of in a novel environment, exposed to so many things. And then you're talking about some brushes to make it a positive experience. You've got to be a little bit careful that we don't overstate the positive experiences, and as long as there are still a lot of negative experiences, I think that's still where the main focus should be, and the positive experiences really come in, as a minor, as long as that's
I think that's a good comment. So we need to keep a focus on that. And as I touched on, it's really about thinking, what more can we do? What can we do differently for the future? And actually, that's another very complex idea, of course, because we have embedded within that the idea of an animal's resilience to cope with temporary negative experiences and what that looks like in different species and different individuals. So again, another complicated idea, but absolutely, you know, we need to, although we are taking a positive future focus here, there's still work that we need to fix up to deal with some of the negative aspects. Julie highlighted those very well. Great question. Thank you. We're going to stop there.